You were just listening to remarks at the New York Stock Exchange by the President-elect Donald Trump, surrounded by members of his incoming cabinet as well as his family. I'm Kristen Scholler here at the New York Stock Exchange, and we are going to be covering the President-elect's New York Stock Exchange visit over the course of the next hour, including the President-elect ringing the opening bell to open the markets at 9:30 a.m. Eastern. The President-elect's visit coincides with Time naming Donald Trump Person of the Year for a second time. And with more, I do want to bring in political expert, friend of the New York Stock Exchange, JD Durkin. He's also a contributor at CBS News. JD, it's great to have you on the show today. What a historic moment for incoming President Donald Trump and his administration.
And the New York Stock Exchange community as well. I mean, we always say this is one of the most iconic institutions in the entire world, and I think what a symbol of success, of representative, the strength of the American financial markets. A huge moment for the incoming administration, but hey, this is really one of very few presidents in history to ever visit the trading floor of the NYSE. So very exclusive territory for the incoming president-elect.
And we're going to be talking about all of the history behind that here at the New York Stock Exchange over the course of the next hour as we await that opening bell in just about 15 minutes time. Of course, President-elect Donald Trump will ring the bell as one of the most visible symbols of success. A born and bred New Yorker. Trump is, JD, appreciates the stock market. We heard that on display with those remarks in the boardroom, and certainly has embraced magazine covers over time. What does this signify for Trump?
Well, I think back, and I rewatched it last night when President Ronald Reagan visited on March 28th, 1985. It was a message that the United States of America is open for business. Kristen, it was a message of deregulation, a message of cutting taxes, a message of reducing the amount of federal government spending and indicating that this is a bull market. Basically, hear us roar was the message from Reagan in 85. And I expect any additional commentary we hear from the president-elect to be very much in line with that. Of course, worth noting, Reagan not the only president. George W. Bush also made a visit here in January 2007. I think all of those themes that we've heard from previous Republican presidents while visiting this incredibly historic room will be very much what we hear from the president and all of those members of his cabinet who we just saw here as well.
Of course, the president-elect, members of his administration and his family making their way down here to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange to get ready to celebrate that opening bell. And as those remarks, JD, were underway in the boardroom here at the Stock Exchange, the president-elect saying that there is a very strong economy in play, but that there are problems that need to be fixed, specifically calling out Scott Bessent, his pick for Treasury Secretary, and Howard Lutnick, Commerce Secretary. Talk to me more about members of his administration and what they can do that we saw on display in the boardroom.
Yeah, well, those were the two officials I was looking for, Bessent and Lutnick, to see. And very quickly, Kristen, you and I, while we were watching those remarks, we saw them come out here. But I'm also surprised to see the other members of the cabinet that are here. RFK Jr. is here. We did see Kelly Loeffler. We saw Scott Turner, who's been tapped to lead housing and urban development. Lee Zeldin, longtime Republican congressman here from New York State, set to take over. Pending confirmation, of course, the EPA. And, what's interesting is one of the big economic kind of pain points, not just for the outgoing administration, but for the incoming one, is how do we bring prices down? How do we stabilize inflation? A really notable quote. Trump told this, President-elect Trump said this to Time magazine in his profile that came out today about grocery prices, maybe being a bit honest, saying it's hard to bring these things down once they are up. And that reminds me of commentary we've heard from Jay Powell and other Fed officials to say it's not really that we want deflation across the economy. We want to see a real strengthening of wages across the board. That's going to be a difficult balance, I think, for the incoming White House to figure out and to message on.
And of course, we did hear the president-elect reiterate what one of his campaign promises was, and of course, what he pushed a lot during his first term in office, which is bringing business back to the United States. I want to hear from you as Time has named the president-elect Person of the Year. JD, this comes as other finalists were the Vice President, Kamala Harris, of course, Elon Musk, Kate Middleton, among others. How did he beat out the others for this particular win?
I think as Time phrased it in their kind of profile of the final six, it was really this stunning political comeback, the likes of which we have not seen in American history, citing the kind of removing of the American electorate, and I think the spirit that Donald Trump was obviously able to galvanize across the American electorate. I mean, without a doubt, winning not just a handful of the key swing states, but winning all 7 of these big swing states, that was really, I think, front and center. It's worth remembering, Time Magazine, gives this out, and as they say, for better or for worse, we try and choose the individual who has had the most impact on the world. Obviously, a bit of a different scenario from Taylor Swift winning this last year,
That's
but
right.
Donald Trump does become, I believe, the 9th president in U.S. history to now get this distinction for a second time. FDR did get it 3 times, so President Trump might have a few more years to catch up with Franklin Roosevelt.
We see the stock market, JD, across the board right near record highs. There's been a bit of a breather, but certainly a post-election surge amid that decisive victory by the president-elect, and it comes after the S&P 500 had its best day in 2 years, the day after the votes were tallied. What does Trump's presence here mean to the NYSE community and Wall Street?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the market overall has been up 5% since Election Day, as well as part of, I think, about 25% or so year to date. Obviously, I think for the ultimate showman and the way that Donald Trump likes to brand himself, what better backdrop is there to kind of embody the strength and the spirit, the resiliency of the U.S. financial markets than coming here to the New York Stock Exchange? We know, as there have been with other high-profile guests, there's a ton of enthusiasm for the president-elect visit here today, and I think especially if you're going to clearly communicate once again, much like President Reagan did, that under this new administration, if you're trying to convey to the global community the U.S. is open for business, I would argue there is no better place to do so than coming on here to the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I suspect the president-elect knows that as well.
Of course, the president-elect touting that in those executive boardroom remarks that we were taking earlier. It's interesting, JD, because one of the reasons that we've seen the Wall Street community embrace him is because Trump has promised tax cuts for corporations and less regulation. How do you expect him to push these through in the new year?
Much easier said than done. You're talking about a very narrow margin in both the House and the Senate that Republicans have. You and I have talked before, Kristen. In the Senate, the GOP will have about 53 to 47. But as this new Congress starts, the House of Representatives margin is only going to be 217 to 215. This gets into that wonky conversation I love so much. I know it's kind of weedy, but budget reconciliation. How many cracks at that do you actually get over the year? Bit of a debate right now among Republicans on Capitol Hill. Do you try and go after a hybrid border energy bill, or do you put forward a budget reconciliation bill that tries to handle some of those tax issues, both instituting new tax cuts as well as trying to re-up a lot of those 2017 Trump-era tax cuts, known, of course, as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So no easy task for Republicans to try and thread that needle, because you don't get a whole lot of votes there that you can actually afford to lose if you're going to make any of these things a reality in the new year.
This is the second time that you and I have seen Melania Trump at the stock exchange as well. Of course, she visited us here and was on that Bell podium during Trump's first term in office. She was here to support her Be Best campaign. Obviously back here today. What does that signify? That in addition to members of the president-elect's incoming administration, his family, by and large, is here to support him.
And honestly, I mean, he has just been such a prolific campaigner. We oftentimes did not see members of his family with him out there swinging through the swing states. I think it's a real show of unity from the family. Obviously, yes, Melania Trump making another return visit here to the NYSE. We also saw Ivanka Trump. And Ivanka and her husband Jared have largely been absent from the campaign. That was their personal choice, although they were very central figures for the first Trump administration. Tiffany Trump here as well. And then from time to time, we remember we had a SPAC that went public here, I believe early last year, Public Square Holdings. That brought Donald Trump Jr. Down here onto the floor, a company that liked to fashion itself as kind of the conservative alternative to Amazon, which in and of itself is a fascinating space of the economy. I expect to see maybe more companies like that go public, and which kind of speaks to the general appetite, I think, for IPOs. I think the sense on Wall Street is, Kristen, this is going to be an administration a bit friendlier on the regulatory front, a bit friendlier to mergers and acquisitions. And so I think that's why we've seen a lot of enthusiasm on the small caps and kind of mid-cap size companies that could be good acquisition targets.
I know that you are a history buff, JD, and we've been talking about the history of this moment throughout the morning. What else can you tell us about what this means, today means for America?
Well, I think there's a reason why we walk around the floor here. We see so many photos kind of in the corner of that famous Reagan visit in 1985. I think that's a time when, he took over the presidency from Jimmy Carter, at a time when a lot of people felt very frustrated, felt sour with the status of the American economy, with where prices were and how they fit in. And Reagan really fundamentally shifted that narrative, and he did so speaking directly from the Bell podium here of the iconic NYSE. And I think that's what this means all over again. I think for Donald Trump, the parallels are very similar. Jimmy Carter was a one-term Democratic president, as is Joe Biden, right? His argument's going to be, well, the economy's in better shape than people may feel. But the kind of similarities there to Carter to Reagan versus now Biden to Trump are actually pretty similar, and I think that's largely what speaks to why Donald Trump is coming back here to the NYSE.
And let's note, too, that Times CEO Jessica Sibley is in attendance as well, because the president-elect was named Times Person of the Year.
Yeah.
In terms of that pick, I believe that the formula is based on influence, and certainly the president-elect among the finalists did have the most influence.
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think there's no doubt. And it's not a big surprise. I mean, I hadn't even really studied too closely who the other finalists were without kind of knowing pretty safely this was going to be Donald Trump. What a remarkably anomalous campaign, not just surviving various assassination attempts, but also a history-making candidacy in and of itself. By the end of Donald Trump's first term, he will be the oldest president we have ever had. He's only going to be the second president, the first since Grover Cleveland to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and a whole lot of other history-making components to this as well. I think all of that speaks to the influence that Time magazine felt was important to making their decision.
JD Durkin, CBS News contributor, political expert, friend of the NYSE community. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
I want to bring back JD Durkin, of course. He is a political expert, a member of the NYSE community, and a CBS News contributor as well. JD, you were down there for the opening bell. Give our viewers some color as to what unfolded from your view.
Krista, I think you and I have been down here at the NYSE for probably well over 1,000 opening and or closing bells. I've never seen the floor this packed. I've also never heard the floor this enthusiastic. A lot of excitement here. The sights and sounds of this place, I mean, just absolutely electric. Pardon me while I'm like peering over my shoulder. It's just the scene is incredible. I can see Kevin Hassett. I can see Scott Besson as well. They seem to be getting kind of their own tour of the floor. And then obviously we see here the distinguished guest book gets signed, and then we'll have to go sit back into the wall after and see where they all signed the wall for everyone who was up there on the Bell podium. But yeah, an incredible day, an incredible energy, and we'll see how long they all choose to stick around here for. I know Secret Service likes to keep the president in and out, moving pretty quickly, but he tends to linger and he wants to have conversations, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. I wouldn't be surprised if the president-elect spends a few more minutes down here on the trading floor than they were expecting.
And we are showing a live look of some of those conversations for our viewers, of course, tuning in, seeing the president-elect right under the opening bell podium. He had just signed the distinguished guest book here at the New York Stock Exchange alongside the NYSE president, Lynn Martin. JD, you mentioned the cheers, USA. We heard that palpably, of course, as the opening bell was underway, and key members of his administration in attendance as well. Kelly Loeffler being one of them, small business administrator. That was his pick, of course, and Howard Lutnick and Scott Besson as well. What are the priorities, the day one priorities for President-elect Trump?
Well, I mean, I think obviously tax reform or kind of trying to redo the tax code again is going to be a priority. I don't know how much he could actually work with Congress on that very first day. I am expecting a lot of movement on tariffs, Kristen, for day one, because as you and I have talked about before, Congress has largely ceded tariff authority into whoever the president of the United States is. And that means if you're Donald Trump and you're trying to kind of use this as a negotiating tactic, you want to hold certain countries accountable for imported goods to the U.S., you're probably inclined to say, I don't really need Congress for these. I can sign a handful of tariff-based executive orders. I think those are really the big ones. The president-elect has talked about in recent interviews things like ending birthright citizenship. A lot of people say that may require an entire constitutional amendment, so that's even much more difficult than overhauling the tax code. So I think there are kind of immediate day one priorities, trying to scale back any regulations from the Biden White House that he feels like he can through executive order. Tariffs, I think we'll hear a lot about in those first 24 to 48 hours. And then, of course, for good or for bad, we tend to judge presidencies. I think it's a little unfair personally, but we always look at those first 100 days. And I think we only do that because when FDR came into office, he had such an explosive first 100 days. He sort of set the precedent, and we'll certainly see what the incoming administration will be able to do. But you're talking about a lot of new cabinet officials who have not served in these jobs. But you are talking about a president who has already done the job, and I would assume feels a lot more prepared for it this time than last time.
And a Wall Street community, we should mention, amid those cheers for the president-elect as he opened the U.S. equity markets here on this historic day at the New York Stock Exchange. Less regulation, corporate tax cuts, all elements that we know the community has been supportive of over time. I was speaking to an economist earlier, JD. He said he still anticipates decent growth next year. And interestingly, the president-elect painting that picture during those executive boardroom remarks as well, saying that the economy is very strong, but there are still things that need to be improved. Speak to me more about how his cabinet is going to help him execute that vision.
Well, I think these are going to be the sorts of individuals who proudly say, I serve at the pleasure of the president. This is Donald Trump's administration. I know we've made a lot. We've looked at a lot of the individual picks for various cabinet officials, labor, agriculture, et cetera, and said, well, that one person, that individual person's background makes you think that he or she leans this way, even though Trump leans that way. I have no doubt, Kristen, that at the end of the day, all of these people are being put into this position because the president-elect feels confident that they can carry out his vision, which again is now baked on an already pre-existing 4 years of confidence, having already done the job at the highest levels. But to this point about inflation and the reaction of regulatory and how Wall Streeters viewing this, usually the biggest story of the day would be PPI inflation, which top line was actually a bit hotter than expected. This is the last big inflation bit of data we'll get before the next Fed interest rate decision next week on the 18th. It seems like a bit of a lesser priority story today, but it does remind us those inflationary pressures are present.
It is interesting, too, to look at the economic data, JD, because, of course, that's what the president-elect has been speaking about. That's what his administration will help him on in terms of executing those campaign promises. We've seen the services sector, which has been the stickier inflationary aspect of the economy. Those prices finally start to temper a little bit more. Of course, inflation has steadily declined for the past 2 years since its peak in 2022, but potentially higher prices or the pace of price gains, which is what inflation is, on goods versus the services economy. And of course, the president-elect calling out those grocery prices, which most Americans by and large can resonate with. A voter base, of course, across the country. You had shared on our air that this president-elect Donald Trump, is the first Republican candidate in 2 decades to win the popular vote. And you look at those grocery prices, that inflationary aspect of the economy that is such an essential for every American household, does seem to be one of the factors that has America supporting this president.
Yeah, and higher gas prices as well. It's higher prices, at the fuel pump, at the grocery store, higher prices for rent. I would argue those are probably the biggest determining driving factors for a lot of those uncertain Americans, maybe in those key swing states who said, you know what, after 4 years of Biden, you can paint the picture you want of a strong overall economy. I feel the cracks in the economy in my day-to-day spending. And I think that underscores the conversation you and I had at the top of the hour, which is, what are those Republican priorities? Do they focus on energy production in an effort to try and drive down in any way they can the pain that we're all feeling at the gas pump? Or do you try and put a focus on coming the more easing the regulatory burdens and more of the tax cuts types of conversation? So I don't think it's easy for any president to come in from day one and certainly have a clean slate here. But it's certainly going to be very difficult for Donald Trump and for the Republicans on Capitol Hill to try and figure out what exactly those priorities are. And with that tiny margin that Republicans have in Congress, they need to be pretty careful about which priorities they go after and when.
JD Durkin, member of the NYSE community, political expert, and CBS News contributor, a former colleague of mine. JD, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. What a great day. You're doing a great job, Kristen.
What a great day. Absolutely. Historic day for the stock exchange.